Cool.
All right. I'll give a quick. Okay, so this is the editor extension team follow up from our LSP conversations talking about observable streams and what we're doing in Visual Studio, the Visual Studio extension, and kind of how maybe some of this could be used in JetBrains from just an idea perspective. Cool. All right. So I wanted to give you all. We have this entry point to our application, which is this Visual Studio package class, where we've declared, hey, this is a package, and it will get loaded up. It does like some reflection to say, hey, find plugins that we have code for and load that plugin up. And then we have some callbacks here. So like we have this initialize async, which will be called by the runtime or by the Visual Studio runtime. Really the goal that we have here is we set up a few things, but we have two event handlers for what happens when we open a solution and what happens when we close a solution. So one of the new things that I added here was this concept of a workspace, which really could be called solution. But essentially, when someone opens up a new file, that everything in Visual Studio runs under solution files, SLN files. And those SLN files are they contain everything that would be, there's projects underneath there. Maybe that's just a directory that's got some, got some classes in it or got some files in it, but everything kind of runs off of this. So I have this concept of a workspace ID, which is really just a combination of solution name and solution path. But I now have this concept of a workspace manager, which will listen to those, we just call these events on workspace open, on workspace close. But I actually have created an observable stream of workspace state. So the idea behind this is anyone who wants to know what is the current workspace state, and I'll show you what workspace state looks like right now. It is a discriminated union of various classes. We have the concept with no workspace state, workspace initialization failed, workspace initializing, and then the workspace that is active. And I wanted to do this because I didn't want to have to do something where, make sure that you don't use these properties if you are in this state kind of deal. It's like this would end up being null if we were in some other state, if we all put them in one class. Decided, hey, I'm just going to put them in separate classes and we'll do a big, pattern matching switch statement on it. Anyways, that's not that big of a deal, but what I've done is I have a this workspace ID subject. And so RX works in this way where there's you have observables and observers. And then is everyone kind of familiar with observables? Okay.
Yes.
Cool. So what I end up doing is these are the new workspace IDs that are coming through from that Visual Studio package, or really anything that calls this method, the on workspace open or on workspace close, which is what is an implementation of this iWorkspace lifecycle handler. So if anything says I need the iWorkspace lifecycle handler, they can call on open solution or on close solution. Well, what that ends up doing is just saying, hey, given that workspace ID, we are, if it doesn't have a value, we're going to assume that we've closed out of this workspace and we're in no active workspace land. If it does have an ID, then we need to return this observable from async, create workspace async. So the idea behind this is we might have some initialization that needs to occur on a workspace. We still want to be in this. So I'm creating this observable where this will eventually give me back something, but we start with workspace initializing. So essentially we have this process where it'll start with workspace initializing, it will create the workspace async, and then I could do something where, and I should probably do something where, not cast, but catch, where if I catch an exception, and it should be of workspace state and exception, I think that's what, yeah. And the type of exception I want to do. And I could say something like, all right, now time to create observable.return. And this is going to be a new workspace initialization failed with whatever that error was. So one thing I've also done throughout throughout this application as I've started to work on it more is I'm doing the rusty thing of returning result types rather than throwing exceptions anywhere. And the goal behind that is if you throw an exception that bubbles up inside of Visual Studio, it crashes the entire application. It's terrible. I'm like, what is this? Why can't they have like some try catch around running plugins?
Are you
Um,
serious? Like any
I'm
exception that's not
serious.
handled in your plugin crashes the entire
The
IDE?
entire application. Yes.
Wow.
That's crazy.
Yes.
Dang.
Any type of exception.
Um, I I I believe it's any type of exception. So for instance, if I were up here and people have run into this, this was like a huge deal. Um, on older versions of Visual Studio, they don't have. So I have this concept of the suggestion service telemetry adapter, which takes in this suggestion service base. Well, and that's a Visual Studio implemented dependency. If Visual Studio says, "Oh, I don't have this because I'm an older version of Visual Studio," it crashes the entire application. Um, and that's what threw me because I was like, why is it not just catching and putting that in a a log message somewhere? Um, um, and turns out, yes, if you just throw an exception and it doesn't get caught anywhere, it's a problem.
Does it not run, does it not run plugins like in some type of isolated?
No,
No, that's weird.
it's just untrusted code everywhere. That's the Visual Studio way. It's a little scary. Like one thing that we have, and I think there was some discussion about this in the JetBrains users, like the GitLab users of JetBrains, the products. There was some discussion of this on for, hey, other plugins can read the other plugins' secrets. Um, um, well, welcome to Visual Studio where you can just read absolutely anything, and the way Visual Studio handles like secrets is they actually put them in the system registry. So it's all Windows, so we have a registry, and you can just read those. I mean, from any plugin that's installed.
That's crazy.
Um, so yeah, even if you did like some kind of like obfuscation, we're still. I mean, we're an open source uh, project, so it doesn't really obfuscate very much. Because we got to run it locally.
Right.
Anyway, so yeah, I will jump back to. So, anyways, I wanted to have it where workspaces were an observable stream of these states because these states can change. And then another thing that we have an observable stream of is our application settings. So we have this folder called settings util, which should be called settings. And I wrapped what was happening in here to say, hey, previously we had it where we would send out it was like a delegate in C# where things would change, and as things would change, you'd have to subscribe to the on change event and then know, oh, well, I need to go, look at my settings object again. And it was just it's kind of gross. So I just wrapped that inside of an observable. So now someone can just say, hey, give me the latest settings object, which might be the same object, same reference, but it's just now it's all in one subscribe call. Okay. So with both of those things, then the latest feature that was like sort of asked was, hey, we have all of these states in which in which code suggestions should not be available. So what I ended up doing was saying, okay, I did have this giant class that had every possible like, oh, we gotta check this, then we gotta check this, and then we got to make a call to say, hey, are we under the right GitLab version and stuff like that. And so what I ended up doing was creating a single, well, we have this code suggestion state, which should probably just be is code suggestions enabled. But it has 3 properties on it, a Boolean of whether or not we're enabled, some message, which is what we're going to end up displaying to the, we're going to put into the toolbar. And then whether or not this click handler, because right now you can click on the toolbar and enable, disable code suggestions from that way. And so that's the current state. And I have my state observable is really basic. What it does is we have an enumerable of these other evaluation services, which could really just be like their sources for state. And then it combines all those sources together, given a priority list. So that priority list comes from the state themselves. That's probably not great, but it's what I've got right now. And I have 3 services. One it validates settings, and it actually has these independent validators or evaluators where it'll go, hey, what are my settings? I can see, are my settings configured? If we're not configured, return disabled. If if code suggestions is not enabled, return disabled. If we couldn't create a URI out of our GitLab URL, go ahead and fail early and say, go ahead and disable it. And then if not, return enabled. And we do this for every kind of thing. So it essentially, like I have a version supported evaluator. And what it does is creates the API client based upon the settings. And then I went very functional programming with my result type, and I've got binds and maps and things like that, where essentially I say, hey, given this client, go ahead and evaluate async, which could return a result. Grab metadata, check the version, and then say if it's a supported version, we return enabled. Otherwise, we're going to return disabled based upon whether or not we're self-hosted or not. Right now, I'm checking self-hosted by, hey, is this a known GitLab URL? There's probably better ways, but I went asking around, and people said, yeah, that sounds right. And so I have these different evaluators, and then I have like this is the user provisioned. So that calls the is code suggestions enabled for user, and then either returns enabled, disabled. That's just kind of, I'm considering that being like we're just setting up is the global state of this thing. We know if this works or not. And this will recalculate anytime the settings observable changes. So anytime we have a new settings object. Now, workspace only evaluates under 2 conditions. One being the settings observable, only if it's changed either the GitLab URL or the GitLab access token. And then combines latest with the workspace observable, which is my workspace active? Is it inactive? And then I do resolve code suggestion state based on the current settings and the current active workspace, where I say, hey, if we have no active workspace, we're disabled because we have no active workspace. If we're workspace initializing, we're disabled because we're currently initializing. Either initialization failed, or if we're active, we have to do a separate resolution. And I put it all in the same class because this is the only resolution currently for workspace, which is code suggestions, is this project enabled for code suggestions? And that's where I have this Git repository factory based on the solution path, get the repository, given the repository, get the remote info, grab the project path, zip the client result, and that make the call for is code suggestions enabled for project, and then and I think Laura's working on this. I saw something where she was doing something very similar to this. So that's where that logic sits. But they all kind of come back together. So, and then I have this token validation evaluation service. So what this does, and this is where I needed something, because this is actually a notification from the language server. So if the language server comes back and says, hey, your token's invalid, I need to be able to respond to that with well, we need to disable things. But I also need to say when settings have changed, I need to re-enable them. So I have these 2 observable streams. And I merge them and start with, hey, this is enabled until we say otherwise.
So
Now,
sorry, when you do
yeah,
this, so you do a settings change, it'll run through the whole flow again, and then even if the language server might say again, oh, this is
yes, but I don't know
say,
that, so I can't really. And the language server, I'm not guaranteed a message from the language server. Like if everything's cool, the language server doesn't send me anything. Uh, so when settings change, I kind of need to just sort of treat everything like, hey, we're good to go, but don't, but be prepared for there might be an issue, that gets notified later. But I have these priorities where essentially, if um, um, if the extension settings evaluation service we have a disabled that comes through, we take that over any of these other ones. We treat that as being a higher priority disabled, and it's just the message. It's really all I'm interested in. But if workspace has an issue, then I would, and settings was fine, then I would treat that one as being priority over that token validation one. Now, one thing that we could do, and I had this working this way to begin with, was it would have to emit in a particular order. So we right now these run sort of independently. So as long as we're subscribed to their observable streams, then workspace will run anytime settings changes or the workspace changes. Now, the cool thing about this is that if the workspace changes, I don't re-evaluate any of the other observables. I'm only re-evaluating just the workspace observable. Um, um, and um, and then if settings changed, but it wasn't a GitLab URL or GitLab access token change, then this workspace one wouldn't reevaluate. It would reevaluate the extension settings evaluation service would reevaluate, and the token validation service would reset itself. But this one wouldn't, which is kind of neat because you end up saving yourselves a few async calls that. But anyways, that's kind of how I had this set up, where I wanted to, and at one point I wanted to just make everything a I wanted to just make everything an observable stream, but then I went, that's probably a little much. And you do get some, you get these kind of, it starts to look like a functional programming language where you're just kind of like passing lambdas, into everything. And so it can kind of look a little different than like imperative style, stuff that I usually see in like a JavaScript project or something. Um, so I think that it's definitely sort of you have to get used to this kind of, if you're not used to writing it like this, it can probably look a little strange. But for like C#, we have Link. I don't know if anyone's used Link, LINQ. It's a way of like working with enumerables. Essentially, if I had like a var L equals new list, let's say there's a list of integers, then I could kind of bind everything to say, oh yeah, I want to do a L aggregate, starting with 0, X and Y. So this is kind of like this is very built into the language now, where I could just go, hey, let's return X plus Y. And and then I could do the whole thing and select on something. Oh no, this is actually return to value. So this is essentially this is the sum of all values in the and of course this would be better just do this than sum. That's a thing. But essentially I think sum under the hood uses this. And So it's not too foreign for C# developers to kind of go, oh, I've got a bunch of chained methods that just kind of continue to build onto the type that currently exists. But yeah, so I've kind of treated everything as an observable, and it's been pretty cool to work with because I can I can kind of fine tune, hey, I know when this will run, when this won't run, but it's also still separate, and I don't have to, I can maintain it separately than it needing to necessarily be in this. And I mean, yes, I could have done interfaces and just DI'd everything, but and that's kind of what I did with this anyways. But
Do you feel like this architecture would like help across IDEs if you had similar pattern? Or do you think every IDE is specific?
I think it kind of depends. I felt like we had a situation here where I was like, there's just so many possible states for this one thing to be in. It didn't necessarily make sense to me that I would just recalculate every time, you know. As soon as I had multiple sources that I need to look at, hey, workspace could change and settings could change. And then I could also get notifications from the server. I kind of went, I feel like there's a lot of things that go into this, and I need to listen to all of them. And that's when I started going, I think observables made sense. Um, I and I would almost say that makes sense in any place where something like that happens, but I do think it adds a little overhead from a you probably have an overhead in two ways. One, you do get that kind of like cognitive overhead if you have to sort of think about observables. And it is a bit of a context shift. But then you also get a little bit of a performance hit because you are dealing with lambdas everywhere, and so that means that you have the concept of, you know, you've got a closure, but I have to do captured variables that are coming into somewhere else. So that means they're coming into a different call stack, and so it ends up, or just like a variable stack on the frame, or however it's implemented in C#. But you do have a bit of a memory overhead, and so you want to be careful with what you're kind of capturing inside of a closure. But I think that it worked out for this case.
Is there a file where you store the current state? Is that code suggestion state?
So actually the observable, so the current state, I don't store that anywhere. So what ends up happening is, yeah, let me show you how it's used. That's probably the most
Yeah,
important.
like basically, my question was, if
Yeah,
someone starts typing in the IDE and something requests code suggestions, what happens there?
that's a great idea. Or great question. So inside of code suggestions, we have this GitLab proposal source. And so what GitLab proposal source is, and I need to dispose of this. I need to make sure that happens. Anyways, code suggestion, state subscription. So I subscribe to the state, and I actually just store it in a local variable. So it does mean that I am storing a reference to, so it's not like copied every time the subscription happens, but I'm storing that reference here, and this is the current state. So anytime that state changes, I put it here. And I need that because I didn't want to change this whole file with how it was working before, but I technically just say, hey, if it's not enabled, go ahead and not run these functions. That is how this file was set up. And so you can definitely be in the middle of a session and then something happened where we need to disable things, and then we no longer send messages to the language server. So for instance, let me go down to it should be, yes, request proposals async. So this actually is we're providing an implementation. This class, GitLab, or like just proposal source, is something that Visual Studio provides. And so we're providing an implementation for proposal source. And essentially what we do, hey, if this thing gets disabled, we're not communicating and we're not going to provide any more sources. And then I do think that the source provider would still, yeah, we still will we'll still create a proposal source even if things are disabled, because they could become enabled during the lifetime of that file, because essentially it's every file we get a new proposal source. Yeah, I have a cat in here attacking all my stuff. uh, yeah, does that answer your question, Ali?
Oh yeah, that's super helpful. I think in JetBrains we have an opportunity to clean things up and simplify and add a little bit of architecture and abstraction to help with that. So we can definitely use this as inspiration.
Cool, awesome. Well, that's great. I really do like split. So I don't love that I put this inside of state underneath code suggestions. I sort of want to do something very similar to almost have like a duo status. Um, uh, and I feel like this is a better naming. Some of these namings, I don't love that this is called like evaluation service. I feel like I guess I'm evaluating something, but I was like, it still feels very vague, and so there's things that I want to change just I think it would be easier to grasp, hey, what's going on here. Um, but cool. Yeah, if it inspires good change, then that's good. If it hopefully it doesn't inspire bad change. Or like unmaintainable code. Right now I'm really enjoying it, but um I know I've worked on projects where the observables just get so out of hand to where it's like, hey, how does anything connect? And so you almost need to think about things in terms of like state flow, but we're already kind of doing that in some ways. It's like we're having to maintain state flow in our head, and we're not it's encapsulated in our code, but it's also not like declared in our code, if that makes sense. Like it's not like a declarative way of presenting it. But cool. Yeah, that's all I've got, unless anyone's got more questions.
No, that's pretty cool. I still have to wrap my head around it. So, but
Nice. Well, that's what I've got the 8 MRs open for, is all of that stuff. And I've kind of tried to break it out so that, like, for instance, I've broken it out to where it's like each one of these services are a unique MR, so that you're only trying to look at what am I solving here, rather than needing to. Because I originally started writing everything out, and I did and I was like, I'm gonna open up an MR just to see how many lines I'd changed and everything, and I was like, oh no, this is like 4,000 lines of code. No one's gonna look at this. So I was like, I gotta really break this out. Um, uh, but
cool.
cool. Well, yeah, that's all I got from my side. So Angela, feel free to, I don't know if we're still recording.
Yeah, I'll end it.
Okay.
Cool.